First written in 2009 and reformulated in 2013, the Tallinn Manual is an academic document sponsored by NATO and curated by a very diverse group of legal scholars from exotic places like the UK, Germany, Belgium, Texas, and Utah. It was first published in response to a series of Russian cyber attacks carried out on Estonia in 2007 and regards the application of international humanitarian law, the laws of land, sea, air and space, and the laws of diplomacy to the topic of cyber defence. The first Tallinn Manual addressed only the most disruptive cyber attacks, whose severity would allow states to respond in self-defence, either through cyber or kinetic warfare. But no rubric was set out to match the type of attack with the response that it would warrant. Much like the Scream franchise, the sequel turned down the melodrama of the first edition, and the more practical Tallinn 2.0 was born. Published in 2013 and building on the first edition, it shifted the focus from conventional state-authorised and operated cyber warfare to smaller, deniable cyber activities that are most prominent today. The manual averages around the size of a George R.R. Martin book, with an arguably more coherent storyline than all of Season 8, and advises on jus ad bellum, which is the right to war, and jus in bello, which is justice in war. The manual promotes peaceful conflict resolution, but does provide a threshold for when it is legal to wage war within this jus ad bellum framework. The threshold is breached when cyber operations cause injury, death, or destruction, in which case states have an inherent right to individual or collective self-defence, but only with a counterforce of proportional scale and effect. Now remember this idea of proportionality, since it'll become a little bit more important later on when we look at the limitations within the manual. This is all well and good on paper, but what does this mean for security? Since the manual isn't a new set of laws that states have to abide by, is this just a grand academic exercise in Western ego that just isn't applicable to the majority of states in the international order today? Or is it an active deterrent to conflict by highlighting the dangers of escalating cyber warfare to kinetic warfare? To answer these questions, I think we need to look at the three key limitations. Those being the authorship, the adaptation of the jus ad bellum framework from the physical to the cyber realm, and the ambiguities that plague the manual. With a lineup as diverse as the 2020 Oscar nominations, Tallinn 2.0 worked to rectify some of the shortcomings of the first instalment by expanding the group to include Chinese and Belarusian points of view. However, states like Russia were kept at arm's length, shockingly. The problem with viewing international law and cybersecurity from a Western pedestal is that it creates an echo chamber, which stunts further advancement into what these concepts actually mean. A quick scan of the document also makes it sound like it was written in a legal vacuum, since it references neither the technologies used for the attacks, nor does it provide a general overview of the evolution of these capabilities and how this has shaped conceptions of cyber warfare. Similarly, the manual doesn't even acknowledge power dynamics or cultural differences. For example, weaker states may define cyber attacks on a different scale to their stronger counterparts, since an attack may, disable the whole power grid of a weaker country for several days, including critical infrastructures, banks, ministries, and newspapers. While that same attack on a stronger state may only affect one town or a small city. Eastern states may also value or prioritise different parts of international law, as we've seen with China, who prioritise sovereignty above all else. The lack of valid representation from such a large and diverse group greatly reduces the manual's applicability, and arguably makes some definitions and discussions redundant. In effect, this may actually go some way to threaten international security by making it easier to justify certain acts. The second limitation regards the advice on jus ad bellum, which is about as helpful as Theresa May during a crisis. The concepts of destruction, injury, and death that are needed for states to rightfully and legally respond in self-defence are not defined as they pertain to cyberspace. Destruction, death, and injury in the physical world are easier to spot, but how do we measure the effects of a cyber attack? Does a cyber attack on a financial institution count as destruction? What if injury or death was an unintentional consequence of the attack? Since the manual places a lot of emphasis on intent, how do we judge how far an attack has gone in negatively impacting the way of life of a group of people? Additionally, the idea of proportionality and counterforce, which we came across earlier, is questionable. As cyber capabilities continue to lower the cost of entry into conflict, what constitutes proportional when the power relations in the dyad are asymmetric? Let's explore these terms in a collective hallucination, more commonly known in academia as a thought experiment. Cuba attacks a US military base, and the resulting consequence is the deaths in excess of the population of Cuba. Would a proportionate response from the US be a tit-for-tat type of attack, or financial sanctions, or the complete eradication of Cuba? Is a kinetic response of this level proportional? Asking all of these questions may seem like a cop-out on my part, and it partially is, but it is also a great way of showing the glaring ambiguities in the text, and a great segue into my final point, which regards this lack of consensus. Now, the lack of consensus on a number of points from a group as homogenous as Trump's cabinet is somewhat troubling. Some of the more interesting points of contention include whether cyber espionage violates international law and how to respond to the borderless nature of cyber operations. This discord is troubling since many who use the manual see it as a comprehensive guide on how to act and deal with cyber attacks, and regardless of the author's vehemence in claiming that the manual is meant to be educational rather than prescriptive, through framing it as a guideline on the application of international law to cyber operations, the authors open themselves up to this possibility. A lack of consensus around definitions and appropriate responses could make it easier for states to justify escalating conflicts under the guidelines set out in the manual. Based on these limitations and my extensive knowledge of international law, cyber warfare, and security strategy, I think the manual could do with some improvements. Since cyber operations are incredibly dynamic, it seems pertinent to release a third version of the manual and just complete the trilogy. In the 4 years between Tallinn 1.0 and 2.0, the language went from being somewhat inflammatory, like cyber attack or warfare, to more neutral, like cyber operations. As technology, cyber threats, and interstate relationships have evolved, the next instalment would benefit from accounting for these geopolitical trends by being more inclusive of different viewpoints. Now, this does not mean that it has to lose its legal objectivity, but a level of self-awareness and flexibility is necessary to ensure that the manual does all it can to promote security in the long run.